The secular child care has to obey food safety regulations, not the religious child care. The secular child care has to obey medication safety regulations, not the religious child care. The secular child care has unannounced state inspections, not the religious child care, not ever. The secular child care has to obey staff-child ratios, not the religious child care. All the health and safety laws that apply in the state of Alabama to secular child cares, your standard child cares, do not apply to religious child cares. But don't worry, don't worry. The head of the Alabama Christian Coalition said, the pastors and the congregations are our quality control for the child cares. And to be fair, let's consider maybe this was an anomaly, a fluke, except that there was a little boy named Demyron Lindley. Demyron Lindley was 3 years old, and he was left alone in a van in the sun in Alabama for 10 hours, and then he died, alone in a van in a religious child care. Now, deaths, horrible deaths like these, are uncommon, but much more common are children neglected in religious child cares, children who are left in their own feces for hours where there's bad child-staff ratio. That is the situation of privileging of religion under American law. Even in the state of Maine, where I served in politics for 10 years, not a state that's known to be dominated by the religious right, there's an exemption in state law that says if, and only if, you assert a religious reason as a parent, then you can exempt your child from vaccinations at small child cares, which endangers that child, but also endangers the child and the community with whom they come in contact. And that's in a northern state not known for domination by the religious right. And we're talking about situations of serious endangerment. I want to tell you another story, an ancient story, like the one from the Bible, except this is a true story from about 500 years ago. It is a story of the Incas. The Incas had a ritual in pre-Columbian times. They would take children and they would inebriate them, and they would bring them up to the mountains, and they would kill them as a sacrifice to their gods. That was part of their religious heritage. But compare that, where they at least inebriated the child, and they did kill the child quickly, to something that happened in the 21st century, in this decade, in the United States of America. There was a girl named Jessica Crank. Now, Jessica Crank was 15 years old, Tennessee, and Jessica had a tumor that started to grow on Jessica's shoulder. Now, it was a tumor totally treatable by modern medical science, but Jessica's mother did not believe in modern medical science. Jessica's mother believed in the Epistle of James to address medical issues. So while the mother was talking about the Epistle of James, the tumor was growing and growing on Jessica's shoulder until literally, not figuratively, literally, she had a tumor the size of a basketball on her shoulder. She was in agonizing and horrible pain, and then she died. Now, I bet you there are people in this room who I want to thank because they probably spoke out against torture at Abu Ghraib, and that was a good thing. Thank you for whoever did that. Nothing that happened at Abu Ghraib was as horrific and agonizing and horrible and painful and then leading to death as what happened to Jessica Crank in the United States of America. Where were the right to life groups on this one? This person was born. Where was the right to life for that human being? And you know, remember Sarah Palin, she was talking about those death panels. Well, here's a situation of death panels, a two-person death panel that decides whether or not another human being lives or dies. That's the situation that we're in the United States of America, because this happened because of privileging in American law, where you saw politicians in Tennessee who succumbed to pressure from religious lobbying that mattered more to these politicians than did modern medical science or the life of this girl. That's what we're seeing in the United States of America today. And I want to talk to you about a third form of religiously based child abuse. This one is much more commonly discussed. I'll illustrate it with Father Paul Shanley. Some of you may know of Father Paul Shanley. He was from my region in New England. Father Shanley attended the Man-Boy Love Association meetings. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that that's wrong. Not a real supporter of the Man-Boy Love Association myself. But you can have a situation where someone does something that's inappropriate. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about something much more systemic. I'm talking about the fact that Father Shanley's boss, Bishop Daly, knew that Father Shanley was attending the Man-Boy Love Association meetings when he transferred him from Parish A to Parish B to Parish C, endangering children all along the way. That's what we're saying. And you know what the Catholic Church says? And they say it still. They say that they have a First Amendment free expression clause right to keep secret their internal employee decisions when they transfer people within their employ. Now, I started a children's museum in Maine. We had people who had access to children. And I think it would be ethical policy. Luckily, we knew of nothing tragic that ever occurred at our children's museum. But if it did, we would open up our information about any employee about such an allegation, because the first thing that we got to care about is the children. That has not been the position of the Catholic Church with regard to their administration and this assertion that they have this First Amendment right to make secret decisions about pedophiles. And another irony is that in my home state of Maine, of all the moral issues last year that you could talk about helping people in Sudan, you could talk about helping low-income people in the United States. There are a lot of moral issues you could talk about. But in the state of Maine, what was the one issue that the Catholic Church handed out flyers regarding every Sunday? Against gay marriage in the state of Maine. So that required action on their part, while their lawyers were simultaneously and sometimes successfully postponing cases with this argument about how we can keep secret our internal employment decisions. Now, what you'll hear when discussing these types of issues is that, again, it is a First Amendment right. It's a constitutional right, freedom of religion. The only problem is that is not true. In the Prince versus Massachusetts case, 1943, the Supreme Court was clear that you cannot place a child in a situation of ill health or death on the basis of religion. And even under this Justice Roberts Court, they haven't overturned that one yet. So that's the law of the land today. At least it is in terms of rulings. But all these laws that I talked about in Tennessee are widespread. And I know what you're thinking. Alabama with the first situation, Tennessee with the other situation. With regard to the faith healing, the so-called faith healing, I don't call it faith healing, I call it faith killing, because that's more like what it is. But there are over 35 states. It's not just the Deep South. Over 35 states have some form of exemption from law for medical neglect for children. A special right to say that I can neglect my child medically that only applies for religious groups. Why is that? Well, John Witt at Emory University, at the Center for the Study of Separation of Church and State, says that in America today, separation of church and state is no longer the law of the land. How did we get in this situation? Well, for me, I think back to around the corner from here, or a couple miles down the road. I went to Marina High School in Huntington Beach. And when I was in high school, I was a shy kid, and I said, I got to do something to get out, meet people. And so I tried out for a play, and I studied, my lines to be ready to try out for the play, and worked hard. And I got the lead. I got the lead in a play called Inherit the Wind, which is about the Scopes Monkey Trials, and I got the Clarence Darrow part in that play. And let me tell you, if you want to have your worldview affected, memorize all the lines of Clarence Darrow in the Scopes Monkey Trials, and that will affect how you view separation of church and state and evolution and a whole range of other things. But the interesting point here is that that play was written in the 1950s, and it was looking back on the 1920s. And you could tell by the whole spirit, the whole tone of the play was saying, glad we're moving on. Too bad about those bad old days back in the 20s. We're moving on to the uplands, separation of church and state. We're moving on to a more rationalistic worldview. But that's not what happened, is it? That's not what happened in recent 20th century, late 20th century history in the United States of America.